All right, let's dive right into an explainer that is going to completely shatter what you think you know about one of history's most feared figures. We're looking at the cursed life of the medieval executioner, and I can promise you, by the time we wrap this up, your entire perspective on medieval justice is going to be turned upside down. We tend to think of history in these really broad strokes, but when you zoom in on the actual daily lived experience of the guy holding the axe, a truly haunting story emerges.
Picture this for a second. You're standing up there in front of a screaming crowd. You're covered in sweat, covered in blood, gripping this massive, heavy weapon, all while knowing the exact same people cheering for your work consider you an absolute monster. If you do your job perfectly, they cheer for a couple of seconds and then totally forget you exist. But if you mess up, that festive crowd could instantly turn into a violent mob ready to literally tear you apart. You're surrounded by thousands of eyes, and yet you have never been more alone. What if the man society feared most wasn't powerful at all, but was actually a prisoner himself?
Because Hollywood has fed us this very specific, very persistent myth, right? The executioner as the sadistic, hulking brute in a black hood who just loves his job and relishes inflicting pain. It makes for a great movie villain, but the historical reality, it paints a way darker, way more tragic picture. Most of these men absolutely did not choose this life. They didn't just wake up one morning and think, hey, I want to be the town killer. They were trapped. They were extreme social outcasts and heavily psychologically traumatized. They were born into this generational curse that they quite literally could not escape, bound by laws that locked them into a lifetime of violence.
Which brings us to this cursed bloodline, the ultimate social trap.
See, once a single ancestor took on this profession, and usually it was because it was the job literally nobody else would touch, or maybe they took it to get a pardon for their own crimes, your entire family line became socially poisoned. Society demanded these constant executions to keep order, but they basically forced the executioners to endure rapid-fire indignities every single day because they were seen as physically contaminated by death. They were completely exiled, forced to live in these isolated houses way outside the city walls. Normal citizens wouldn't shake their hands or even make eye contact. At the market, shopkeepers made a point to serve them dead last and wouldn't even touch their money directly. In some towns, they were actually banned from walking through the normal church doors and had to sit in segregated, roped-off pews.
And that stigma didn't just end with a dirty look in the town square. Marrying into a respectable family? Yeah, entirely out of the question. Executioners had to intermarry with the daughters of gravediggers, skinners, or other outcasts. It created this closed-off underworld of dishonorable families, simply because nobody else would have anything to do with them. We actually have surviving diaries from medieval executioners, and let me tell you, the most heartbreaking details are always about their kids. Their children were bullied, totally isolated, and kicked out of local schools before they were even old enough to understand why the town hated them. It wasn't just a grim job. It was an inherited social death sentence.
But honestly, the social isolation was just the warm-up. Let's look at the impossible job itself and the sheer chaos on the scaffold.
On execution day, the crowds would show up incredibly early, treating the whole thing like a carnival. You had vendors walking around selling hot food, kids sitting on their parents' shoulders for a better look, people drinking, laughing, singing. Public death was premier entertainment back then. Now contrast that chaotic, festival energy with the terrifying reality of the executioner. He had to walk into that massive sensory overload perfectly silent and hyper-focused. He knew that the executioner's sword was unwieldy, and one slip on a bloody scaffold, one slightly dull blade, or even one unpredictable flinch from the prisoner could cost him his own life. We kind of just assume beheadings were this perfect instant strike, like in the movies. But step one actually required immense physical strength, deep anatomical knowledge, and perfect precision to cut through dense muscle and bone in one go. Because if step two happened, a failure from nervous hands or a struggling prisoner, the victim would cry out in agonizing pain. And then step three was immediate. That happy singing crowd, they would instantly morph into a furious, violent mob. The historical records are absolutely packed with accounts of angry crowds storming the scaffold to attack and sometimes even murder an incompetent executioner. 12. Think about that number for a second. That is the number of agonizing strikes it took one executioner to decapitate a prisoner. We see this heavily documented in the infamous case of the English executioner Jack Ketch during the execution of the Duke of Monmouth. Ketch missed his mark over and over again, requiring blow after blow while the crowd watched in absolute screaming horror. Imagine standing in front of thousands of furious people while a victim suffers like that because your first strike failed. Ketch's reputation was ruined forever. His name literally became a dark punchline. It perfectly illustrates that razor-thin wire these men walked between doing the state's dirty work and becoming victims of the mob themselves. And the crazy thing is, swinging the axe wasn't even the whole gig. They had to administer the rack, break bones on the wheel, and brand petty thieves. Because they dealt with the human body so intimately, they actually had to know anatomy way better than most university-trained doctors of the time. But since society dumped all its darkest responsibilities onto them, they were forced into some seriously bizarre side hustles just to make ends meet, disposing of rotting animal carcasses, cleaning up gruesome crime scenes, emptying latrines. Strangely enough, some even sold medical remedies made from the human fat or bone of executed criminals, because folks back then firmly believed the remains of violent men held powerful magical healing properties. Wild, right?
So this brings us to a really crucial question. How do you survive a job where death is literally your only legacy? What actually happens to a human mind when the state forces you to suppress all natural empathy and just inflict brutal pain for decades, while your entire town watches and judges your every move?
Well, that leads right into the psychological ruin, a mind completely destroyed.
Imagine just trying to sleep, hearing the terrified screams of dying people echoing in your head every single night. The psychological toll utterly destroyed so many of these men. They suffered from extreme PTSD centuries before doctors even had a word for it. To survive a job where showing even a hint of fear or hesitation was a death sentence, they grabbed onto whatever desperate coping mechanisms they could find. Diaries show they frequently turned to heavy drinking just to numb the horrors of the day. They slipped into deep emotional detachment, battling severe, untreated depression, deep paranoia, and violent tempers that tore their already isolated families apart.
And then you have to stack immense guilt right on top of that trauma. The medieval justice system was, frankly, incredibly flawed. These executioners knew, often firsthand, that they were frequently torturing and killing completely innocent people. This was especially true during the sweeping paranoia of the witch trials. Imagine being ordered to torture the local baker or a neighbor you've known your whole life, all based on religious hysteria or corrupt local politics. These guys became the tragic tools of fear, forced to carry out horrific acts even when they knew the person was innocent. Because refusing an order? Not an option. Say no to the magistrate and you're stripped of your job, exiled, or worse, you become the next prisoner tied to the rack. Which brings us to their role as literal tools of the state, the very face of fear. There's a historical phrase from our source material I want you to really absorb here. Fear was power. Public death was propaganda. Kings and local nobles absolutely relied on the executioner to maintain tight control over the masses. Sometimes executions were intentionally designed to be drawn out and exceptionally brutal, like being drawn and quartered, just to send a terrifying, unforgettable message of absolute obedience. The justice system weaponized extreme violence as this highly orchestrated public theater, and the executioner was basically forced to be the lead actor in a play he never even auditioned for. And here is the wild paradox of the whole thing. Because their skills were so desperately needed for the system to function, towns actually incentivized the role. Some of them made really good money, got free housing, monopolies on local trades, and special legal protections. But the ultimate cost was infinitely higher than any paycheck. Wealth couldn't buy human connection. They spent their whole lives in total isolation, and even when they died, the punishment kept going. The community considered them so spiritually tainted that they were banned from the sacred ground of the churchyard and buried in separate, isolated graves far away from everyone else. Ultimately, what we are looking at is a life sentence. You couldn't just escape. If an executioner tried to flee in the middle of the night, change his name, and start over as a farmer or something, the rumors almost always caught up with him. Someone would recognize him, and that shadow of death would follow him right into his new life, instantly making him an outcast all over again. They were literal prisoners of their societal role, cursed to watch their own kids grow up to inherit the exact same miserable, blood-soaked fate. Once you were in for life. It all boils down to this staggering societal hypocrisy. He carried the burden of society's cruelty while society pretended its hands were clean. Just think about the chain of command. Kings demanded the executions. Judges happily passed the brutal sentences. The public eagerly paid for snacks to watch the gruesome spectacle. Yet the very second the blade swung, all the moral blame, all the spiritual sin was conveniently wiped from the public's hands and dumped directly onto the shoulders of the lonely man holding the weapon. So the next time you hear someone say that medieval life was simpler, leave yourself with this chilling thought. Who was the true monster here? Was it the executioner? A man forced by birthright into a cursed life of trauma, grueling pressure, and absolute isolation? Or was it the society that demanded his existence, cheered wildly for his violence, and then treated him like dirt for doing exactly what they asked him to do? It's a profoundly dark reality that totally flips our conventional narratives upside down, and it really makes you question everything you thought you knew about justice and complicity.